So thanks for inviting me here. I loved my time as a graduate student at MIT. Probably one of the most important things for me was that I was a resident advisor for several years in one of the undergraduate dorms, Baker House, and saw at firsthand the kind of energy and culture that the undergraduates have, and then walked through the infinite corridor every day and saw this flat institutional, what do you know, intellectual culture going on. And I think there was a comment that somebody made earlier that I think was really correct, that scientific, engineering, no-nonsense, unpretentious aspect of the MIT culture is very distinctive and has a big effect on political science as well as every other thing that's practiced here. So as Rick said, we have 8 minutes. We were given very strict instructions on what we were to do. So I will make 4 points, somewhat fewer, a couple of minutes each on our distinctive contributions to comparative politics here. The first point I'd like to make is that MIT's new faculty, new comparative politics faculty in the 1960s and 1970s, I think probably did more than those in any other department, certainly on a population-adjusted basis, to shape and define the modern way in which we do comparative politics. So it might sound incredible now, but if you were to go and read the older issues of the major political science journals in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, comparative government would mean micro descriptions of what happened in country A or country B or country C without very little in the way of with very little in the way of systematic comparison about the longer term institutional, social, economic origins of those kind of differences in a systematic, comparative way that we now take for granted in the discipline. You also wouldn't see a lot of the in-depth fieldwork, the surveys, these longer-term historical institutional comparisons that we now think of basically the way we do comparative politics. So what changed all this? Well, what changed all this, I think, were a series of initiatives by people in the 1950s, the 1960s, the early 1970s, to try and practice comparison. Large conferences, large fieldwork enterprises using money from the Ford Foundation, SSRC organized efforts, US government efforts, to try and have more people make comparisons, to demonstrate how comparative politics ought to be done. And I would say perhaps the most important single initiative was the SSRC-funded Committee on Comparative Politics, whose publications, conferences, support for fieldwork grants such as the SSRC Foreign Area Scholarships really helped to inspire and train a whole generation of graduate students at the elite institutions who then went and spread this idea of modern comparative politics in a much larger terrain. And one important thing to remember, I think, is that MIT people were at the absolute heart of all these initiatives. So the major SSRC effort of the Committee on Comparative Politics that created 9 agenda-shaping volumes, these studies in political development, the money for that initiative was really raised by MIT people. Lucian Pye was chair in 1963 of the CCP when this effort went forward. People in the Committee on Comparative Politics from MIT, like Lucian and Myron, helped persuade the Ford Foundation and other major institutions at the time that we really need more fieldwork grants, we really need more conferences on systematic comparison within comparative politics, and helped create this new terrain of comparative politics that we all take for granted today. 4 of the 9 studies in political development series were edited by MIT people. You know, that's a massive contribution, greater, I think, pound for pound basis than any other department has done. Now, the large amount of work that was done in these years, often characterized as modernization or political development, has come in for a fair bit of flack over the years for its developmental aspects with sort of strict phases of development, for the idea that perhaps it assumes that the West is the model and everywhere else has to follow the West, for being seen as a handmaiden to US foreign policy goals in these periods. And I think some of this is really a little unfair if you actually go back and you read the work. So one one thing I came across as I was thinking about what to say in this conference was Myron Weiner's review of David Apter's 1965 book, The Politics of Modernization. So Myron pointed out that Africa's peoples were actually a lot more internally diverse than Apter's simple developmental typology of consummatory and instrumental value systems allowed. And he also strongly objected to Apter's argument that authoritarian systems might be a better way to modernize than democracies. As Myron pointed out, the empirical evidence on this was in fact really mixed. He also expressed, and remember this was in the mid-1960s, the worry that authoritarian systems once established might never liberalize, saying that, quote, unless we come to grips with this issue, we will find ourselves justifying every petty African or Southeast Asian dictatorship as essential for the establishment of authority or modernization, and we shall view the collapse of democratic regimes as proof that they were not ready for a libertarian system. So I think this reflected not just Myron's own good sense and morality, but also the fact that as a regular visitor to South Asia, with its great internal diversity and, of course, this massive contrast between military rule in Pakistan and democratic rule in India, he was really suspicious of simple generalizations, broad brushes, and easy solutions. And I think that's a characteristic of the kind of research that's been done here. The second point I'd like to talk about is MIT's scholars' incredible contributions to the study of identity, racial identity, religious identity, other forms of identity, and how they've shaped the political world that we live in. So I came here to study with Myron Weiner, and his own book, Sons of the Soil, in 1978, as well as Melissa Noble's Race and Citizenship, Race and Census in Modern Politics, both explore in India and Brazil, respectively, the way in which ethnic and racial identities aren't hard facts, but in fact they're constructed, malleable, created in order to often justify who gets what, where, and when in the polities that we live in. And I think this is one of the big contributions that MIT has made. The idea that identities are, yes, important, but they're also themselves dependent variables with lots of things going into the construction of those kind of identities. Fontini Cristia's work makes the same kind of point. In The Closest of Enemies, her book on civil war, she shows how after Hazaras in Afghanistan formed an alliance with their historic arch rivals, the Pashtuns, against the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, they created new ideological identities and justifications that were then used to try and validate and sustain these kind of alliances. But the fact that they're created doesn't mean they're unimportant. Another big aspect of the MIT approach to looking at identities shows you that once these identities are in place, they can often explain a ton about what happens across a range of other kinds of outcomes. So let's take the example of Lily Tsai's work on China, which shows that the moral standing and soft power of local village temple organizations and local identities is actually the key to understanding why some Chinese villages have much better public goods provision than others. Or take Roger Peterson's work on beliefs and emotions. He's shown us that the role of trust, fear, degradation, and especially resentment in prolonging and identifying conflicts in Eastern Europe and elsewhere has had a major transformative effect on the way that these kind of conflicts evolve. The third thing I'd like to talk about after identities and our kind of shaping role is migration. So in the New York Times today, I think they said that there are around 60 million displaced people in the world today. We see tragically the problems of people on the shores of the Mediterranean at the moment trying to escape from terrible situations in their home country, as well as the public policy challenges this poses in Europe and elsewhere. And it seems obvious to us now that this is a major issue, perhaps the current humanitarian challenge and political challenge to many governments in the world. But in 1974, when Myron, Weiner, Rosemary Rogers, and others, including Nazli Shukri, helped shape this new inter-university committee on migration here in Cambridge that served as a focal point for research, it wasn't seen as such an obvious issue. The migration crisis in some ways was seen as something that had ended in the Second World War, perhaps with some occasional instances after that, like Biafra in the mid-1960s. But this wonderful social intellectual organization that drew in students and faculty from across the Boston area and produced a whole slew of working papers and research over the years on migration has really anticipated much of the research that's been done in the last 5 to 10 years. When I have students or faculty who come in and give talks, I often tell them, look, this work has actually been anticipated by work that's been done earlier by Myron, by Rosemary Rogers, and by others in these series. It's wonderful material. The final thing I'd like to say is just to pick up on a point that Rick made earlier, which is to highlight what I see as one of the good and enduring things about the way that comparative politics is done in the MIT department, even though the cast of characters and their interests might change. And that's the fact that people here go out and do research. They go out into the world. That's something that often, I think, is lost sight of in the current kind of techie phase of political science, but it's very important to go out for long periods, to interview people time and time again, and to open yourself up to things that you don't expect to find. When Suzanne Berger went off expecting continuity in France in the 1970s, expecting change in France in the 1970s amongst the peasants of Brittany, and instead she found tremendous amounts of political continuity that forced her to innovate, change her ideas, build new models. Right? That's where real innovation comes from, opening yourself up to this. And I think that's been a very distinctive feature of the department all the way along. Whatever kind of method you use, you should always be open to doing these new things, and that's something I hope will never change in the way that comparative politics is done here.